Hello everybody and welcome back to episode 3 of my visual effects series where I teach you the basic fundamental skills to get into this and start learning for yourself, either to start your own career or just for side projects, whatever you want to do. This episode we're going to be discussing meshes and how we can apply shaders to meshes in interesting ways to create really cool effects. So let's hop over to the project and see what we got going on. Here we are in Unity. So the first thing we're actually going to need to do is switch to a modeling software. I personally use Maya, but any other modeling software out there can do what we're going to do today for creating a mesh that we're going to be using for VFX purposes. In Maya or whatever modeling software you are using, we want to create a cylinder. Go ahead and scale that up. In Maya, the hotkey to scale up is R. Grab that center of the gizmo and scale it upwards. Okay, so what we need to do is get rid of these caps. The top cap and the bottom cap. We only want the sides here. So what I'm going to do is hold right click and go to face, and this will allow me to select just the faces. So I will just hit Q to switch off of my move gizmo so it doesn't get in the way. Q is just for selections. And we'll go around. Actually, you know what? Better idea here. We're going to highlight the sides. What we want to keep, go up to select, hit inverse, and then it'll invert your selection on your object. Hit that delete key, and we're left with just the sides of the cylinder. If you switch to the face select the way we did using the mouse button, we won't be able to get out of it unless we go up here and click this button and then back to this button. This is basically taking us out of face selection and back into the normal selection where we're selecting the entire object. Now what we want to do is take a look at the UV map of this object. So if we see here, the UVs are stretched out and they're right in the middle. That's not what we want. We want this to fill the entire space. So if we hold right click and go to UV shell, this allows us to select the entire shell. We go up to modify and we click normalize, and this brings it all the way up to the very edges. So this entire shell is stretched to the whole perimeter of this cylinder. So now when we layer in a texture in our shader, it will map itself fully to the outsides of this cylinder. We can go ahead and exit our UV editor now. So now if we click this object, we're going to do something that I didn't do for a long time and I always forgot and regretted it later, is if you're importing these meshes to use for effects, you do not want them to be named P-Cylinder1 or whatever. Up here is where you rename stuff. We're going to just name this Cylinder Effects, no caps. Hit enter, and that renames the object. So now when we import it into Unity, it's not going to have the name P-Cylinder1. We're actually going to have our real name, so when we're searching for our meshes, we can actually type based on context and figure out where this is. Because projects get really big really fast, and sometimes you forget what your meshes are named. So if you just name them something easy to remember like that, Cylinder Effects, no caps, you know exactly what that is, so it's way easier to find. Next thing I want to do is press W to switch to my move gizmo. I want to move this. I don't know why my gizmo is so small right now. I want to move this up to where it's on top of the grid here. And I'm going to press insert to move my pivot point. And I want that pivot point to be right at the bottom of this mesh. That's fine right there. And I hit insert again to lock that in place. So now when I'm scaling this object, if my gizmo wasn't so small. Let me check why that's so small. It was because I hit the minus key on my keyboard and that shrank the size of my gizmo. You just have to hit the plus key to bring it back up. Okay, so as you can see now, the gizmo's at the bottom, so if I were to scale it on the y-axis, it would go from the bottom like this, which is what I want for this effect. I want to be able to scale it up from the bottom like a burst upwards from the ground. And same thing if I scaled it up like this, it would also scale from the bottom rather than the center. So overall, just a way better option to have the pivot down there for what I need this to do. So I go ahead and select the object, go to File, Export Selection. We'll go ahead and just bring this into my documents. And we'll go ahead and name this Cylinder FX No Caps. Hit Enter to export. And now when we switch back to Unity, all we have to do is right-click, import a new asset. Let's go to Documents here and search for Cylinder FX No Caps. Import. Now we have our mesh available to us within Unity. So now if I grab this mesh and drag it into my scene, I can see it in game. Double click it to focus in on it, and your camera will pan in the scene view. So great, we have this, and we can't see the back faces. That's fine, we'll fix that within our shader. So let's go ahead and create a new folder here. Right click, go to Create Folder, and we'll just name this folder Cylinder FX. Just so we can move this stuff into its own folder so it's not in the way. Organization is good, especially when you're in a real project. You want to keep everything in places where you can find it, and definitely places you can find it later, because you're going to forget effects you made from 6 months ago, and you're not going to know where to find it unless you have a decent naming convention. Mine normally aren't that great, but I can generally find what I'm looking for, so it works. So now let's go ahead and right-click, go to Create, Shader Graph, URP, Unlit Shader Graph, and let's name this Burst. Perfect. Double-click to open it up here, and we have the same thing we had last time. Here's our, blank canvas of a shader, and we are going to make something that suits the cylinder burst kind of style. And we're going to keep it stylized because that's just what I like working with most. And stylized effects are so cool. So first things first, let's go ahead and tick the Allow Material Override option here. We can turn off Cast Shadows because we don't need it to be doing that. It's just going to reset itself once I create the new material anyway, but oh well. Let's go ahead and switch Opaque to Transparent. For render face, we're going to want both turned on now so we can actually see the back faces that are invisible currently. If I'm using a material with this shader applied, I'll be able to see both faces, which would be very nice. Okay, let's get into actually creating this material that we're going to use here. So let's hit space. Let's go for a rounded rectangle again. Love that guy. And let's hit space and work with a new node that we haven't used yet. This is going to be the tiling and offset node. And what this does is if we plug it into the UV of this, we can apply offset to our texture, which is extremely helpful for many, many things. You can scroll this up and down, throughout the lifetime of this cylinder and do different stuff with that. Just all kinds of stuff. We're just going to be using this for positioning mainly, but in future effects, I'll show you how you can scroll it over the mesh and get some cool effects that way. Let's go ahead and bring the width up so it fills that whole space there and offset it downwards. You can just eyeball it here. Let's say about 0.3 there, about the halfway mark, and then we can adjust the height. Let's bring it down a little lower so the height pretty much controls the whole thing here. There we go. So now if we adjust the height, we'll be able to fill that space as much as we want to. And we're going to want control of this, and I will show you why right now. So what I'm about to show you is a UV distortion feature, and I love this. I use it all the time. It creates such a cool look, and especially for creating more procedural type things, it's just perfect. So we need to create a lerp node, and I'll teach you about that as we go. Create a UV node, just like that. Move it up here. You can even shrink it down. Yeah, you can collapse nodes like this if you don't really need to see a preview. It's nice to just keep them collapsed. And we are going to need a noise node. These are all new nodes to you. I know, we'll talk about them. So what noise does is it gives you this procedural noise texture. And this is another thing that is just so handy for so many things, and I can't wait to show you all the different things we're going to get into with this. But for now, we're going to use it for distortion. I like to have it at about 25 by default on the scale. It tends to work well for distortion for like stylized stuff, but we can adjust this as needed. We'll add an exposed parameter for that. And the last thing we're going to need here, and we'll actually end up replacing this later, but for now we will use the slider. So what a lerp node does is, I'll show you an example here. We'll just get two colors. Best way I can show you. One's red, one's white, okay? The one at the top, A, this is, hey, this value is set to 0. So give me the white color. This will be B. When this value down here is set to 1, it's going to give you the B value. So if I plug this slider in up here, it's defaulted to 1, and if I move it upwards, I get the red. So this can be used for so many things, switching between textures. If you need to smoothly switch between anything, you can use a lerp node and drag this slider either with an animation clip, or I'll show you how we can do it within particle systems later. And the lerp node goes even further beyond that. You can do some crazy cool stuff like switching colors based on white values. So this basically adjusts the color of the entire thing, because what this slider is doing is it's feeding it a 0 value first. 0 is black. When we're speaking about color information, 0 is black, right? And 1 is white. So what you can do is if I create, we'll do an example with a rounded rectangle. So if I take this rectangle and I plug this into time, instead of a slider, it's going to give me the white background in the red rectangle, because the values it's taking, it's saying anything that is black is being replaced with this white color, anything that's white is being replaced with this red color. So as you can imagine, you can get some really cool results out of this, especially with like a more of a soft gradient kind of effect, like or a texture. So if I were to create a sample texture node right here, and what this does is allows me to plug in any kind of texture I have. So if we grab the default particle and plug it in right here, and I plug this into time, it's going to do exactly what we expect it to do. It's going to have that the whitest value in the center is going to be more red. And as it falls off, it's going to go into more white. So you get a gradient. And we love that. We love gradients in VFX. So it's nice to be able to like procedurally control these colors like this. Yeah, we love the lerp node. It's very cool, but we're going to use it a little differently now. So let's go ahead and get rid of this texture. Don't need that. We don't need these two colors. All we want is we want to say if this value is 1, or sorry, if this value is 0, we want to just have regular UVs. The regular UVs of whatever we plug it into, okay? And if it is this value is set to 1 down here, we want it to be fully a noise. We want it to be fully replaced by noise, the UVs. So let's go ahead and plug our shader in here. We can see it's feeding these noise values into our UV. So what this does for us, if we plug this into the UV of our tiling and offset, because this is plugged directly into the UV of our rectangle, it's a whole thing hooking up multiple things to the UVs. I still haven't always found like the perfect order or method to do this, but this works fine if you plug the distortion into a tiling and offset node. What will happen is, if I adjust this slider upwards, it's going to start distorting this rectangle because it's distorting the UV information. If I bring up the height a little bit here, you can see it's distorting it with this noise as you can imagine, this is perfect for like stylized effects or even normal effects. Realism. You can still use this. So this is perfect for us. Now we want some movement for sure. We don't want this to just be static, right? Because that would look kind of weird. Anything that stays fully static is pretty weird in VFX, so you always kind of want some movement. So how can we do that? How can we move this distortion? Well, I will tell you right now. So we're going to use this same node over here. This tiling and offset node is going to plug into the UVs of this noise. So now, if I were to move this over here and scroll this noise upwards or downwards, it's going to scroll the distortion as well. So I get this really cool, almost fiery looking effect. But how do I keep it scrolling over time, right? Well, that's easy enough. Let's go ahead and reset this to 0. You're going to need a time node. This is basically a always running clock. This basically moves up by a certain amount. It creates a value like a float, and it moves it up throughout time, I'm assuming it's frames per second, whatever. Well, if it's delta time, it's independent of that. I don't know. But what I do know is this will spit out constant increasing values, right? And that's what we want. We want this offset to be constantly increasing over time. So we need a time node, and we need to multiply this by something. Okay, so if I plug this in, let's say I just leave it at 2 like this, and I plug it into this offset. There it goes. It's scrolling over time. But I don't really love that it's scrolling diagonally, right? And that's because this is just taking a constant right now. It's taking one number, and this is going into both x and y, okay? If you look here, just like the tiling, the offset has 2. It has x and a y value. So when I plug just a whole number like this into here, it's going to replace both the x and the y value. And that's why we're scrolling in both the x and the y direction. So what we actually want to do is hit space and go ahead and create a vector 2 as opposed to a float. Okay, floats are single numbers. Vector 2s are split between x and y. So if we plug this vector 2 into here, like you would assume would be plugged into something like this, where it has an x and a y, now we can control the y specifically, and we can make it scroll upwards. So if I put a value of like -0.2, it's going to slowly scroll this noise upward and slowly scroll our distortion. And we love to see it. Very cool. Looks very stylized, very fiery. So let's go ahead and get some more controls in here so we can really get going on this effect. So let's hit space and go ahead and plug a vector 2 into the tiling. Now we want to set these to 1 because you want at least a 1-to-1 here on the tiling, just like it defaults to. What tiling does is it either tightens it up or loosens it up on the x or the y. So if I lower the x, it's going to way stretch it that way. If I raise it, it's going to squeeze everything together. Same for the y. It's going to lower it, squeeze everything together. So we want that kind of control because that will help us kind of offset how our UVs are. So if our UVs are stretched around an object, around the mesh, we can kind of combat it with changing our tiling of our texture. That way we don't have to worry about a bunch of weird UVing tricks. We can just stretch something to the space of the entire UV space for an object, and then we can fix it later with tiling here. Okay, let's do a quick recap here. We have a rounded rectangle. I kind of flattened it out and laid it along the bottom. I had to scoot it back up a little bit on the height so we could actually see what was going on after the distortion. We have a tiling and offset node here plugged into the UV so that I can offset it if I want to. We have our distortion function here, which is a lerp node. Which, remember, this slider decides between the two things, and you can keep it in between, just like this, so it won't fully just be noise distorting the texture. It can be a little bit of both, so it's a slight distortion. And remember, that's a noise node, and just a regular UV node. This says, hey, these are normal UVs. They're not messed with. And then we're messing with them. And then we have a tiling and offset node plugged into that noise so that we can scroll the noise throughout time using this function over here with a vector 2, so we can split it up between X and Y. I hope everybody can keep up now. I'd say the worst part is over. So let's go ahead and start plugging things in to see how it looks in the actual game. So let's plug this into the base color. Let's do a split node here, so we're only grabbing the alpha of this texture, which right now is the same exact thing because it's white. Alpha is just white. We plug that into the alpha. Okay, and then we hit save. If we go back to our game, into our scene, let's right click and create a material. Remember, if you right click on the shader and hit material, it'll create a material with that shader. We'll just name this cylinder. Drag it on top of there. What's going on here? Oh, this doesn't have alpha information. Doi. You don't want to split it. If you had a regular texture that actually had alpha information, you could, but we just want to plug it in like that because this is already white. No alpha information on this. So just plug it directly into the alpha. Hit save again. Now we can see our cylinder here is doing the thing. So it's mapped all around. You will see a seam back there. There are ways around that we'll talk about later. Also, if you see it kind of jittering and stuff, it's because I'm not like clicked into the scene or holding Alt and panning or anything. Yeah, you have to actually like hold Alt and pan if you want to see the stuff playing. I don't know why it does that. If you let go and are just looking at it like normal, it'll be really jittery. But yeah, if you're holding or scrolling or whatever, you'll see the stuff moving as you would expect it to. Yeah, we'll talk about options for removing seams on stuff later down the line, but it's not normally that noticeable, especially with how quickly a lot of effects move. So yeah, let's go ahead and add some more controls, and let's add some color control here, and I'll show you how we can fix this kind of stretched tiling we have, where it's kind of stretched a little big on the Y or on the X around. It's kind of fat. So let's go ahead and add controls and clean that up. Okay, back into our burst shader here. Let's go ahead and hit space and create a float. And let's just default this to 1. Plug this in. This will control our height, right? So if we right click it, convert to property, remember we did that last time, and it'll bring it over here so we can actually change this in the material. So if we right click and hit rename, we'll name that height. Perfect. Now we can control the height from our material. Now, I think the offset's fine at that like 0.55 right there, so we'll just leave that. I don't think we need to change that really, especially since we can just change the height here. Let's convert this to a property, and we'll name this our distortion. We can go ahead and create a float to plug into the noise, and this will control the noise scale, just in case we want it to be more granular. I'll show you how that looks once we actually get in. So let's convert that to property and name that distortion scale. Perfect. Remember, this controls the tiling of the noise that we are using for distortion. So let's convert that and name that distortion tiling. And this is controlling our speed of our distortion scrolling upwards or downwards, whatever we want, or left to right. Let's convert that to a property. Let's name that distortion speed. Perfect. And I want some color in here, so let's go ahead and create a multiply node. Multiply it by a color. I don't know why it loves to default to black. Just like defaulting to white just makes more sense. because if it's black, you can't see it. Why would it default to that? So plug this into the multiply, and we're multiplying the texture with the color, plugging that into the color spot right there. So now if we convert this to a property, we can control the color of the effect. I went ahead and just moved that upwards. You can kind of organize things by what they are. Like I try to keep all the distortion stuff together. And I'll show you something cool you can do here. If you click one, hold Control to click multiple, highlight them all, maybe hit the plus up here and go category. I'll actually put them in a category, and you can right click that category and rename it. So we'll just rename this to distortion. Now, I save and exit and I go to that material. Distortion is under its own kind of drop down box here, so if I wasn't messing with it, I could just hide it and not worry about it. Cool stuff. Okay, let's go back to our scene view here. So now that we can control more things in real time here, we can see what it looks like when we adjust the distortion amount, the distortion scale. If I increased that a bunch, it would get more granular. Just like that, which might be a look you're going for. I personally don't like a super granular look, so I go for a more blobby 25. And we want to fix this tiling, right? Because as we saw when we made this mesh in Maya and we were UVing it, because it is naturally kind of longer on the top, especially if we were to like scale it upwards, our UVs are getting stretched, or we scaled it downwards or anything. It's stretching our UVs. And we don't like that. I'm hitting Control Z, by the way. If you see things snapping around, I'm just undoing. I undo all the time if I'm messing around and just trying to see what stuff looks like. So, how can we fix that? Well, let's just adjust the tiling on the X. So if we scoot this around, we can see, we can kind of sharpen it up, right? And now that I've kind of tightened it up and made it not so blobby looking, kind of a little granular for me, so I can even go lower on this now. Lower on the scale. And I'll have a nice sharp looking burst, right? That's the whole end goal here. We're creating a cylindrical kind of burst effect. And if I adjust the tiling on the Y and make it smaller, it's going to make it kind of sharper, right? If it's at like 0.1, it's going to be sharper on these tips because I'm not giving it as much room. So if I increased it, it would be flattening it. But if I decrease it and I say up, 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 up as far as you can go, stretch on the Y, then it's forcing it to be more spiky, which is how I normally like my cylindrical bursts to be. Let's increase the speed to like -1. Now it's really bumping. I don't know if we actually want it that high. We probably will once we get it into a particle system and working, but yeah, so we have a lot of great controls now. We can switch the color. Remember, we can change the intensity to add a little bit of glow. So this is already, it's given us a good amount of control. So if we were to want this to like burst out of the ground or something, this would probably be, I think the texture is a little high right now, because this is a lot of full space right here. We probably want to bring down the height a bit. Yeah, so it's more like that, right? So now, if this were to grow out of the ground, it would be like, bam! Spikes, right? Very cool. But I like to do a little trick, alright? And I like to get 2 tones of color in this kind of thing. So I'm going to show you how I personally do that. So let's go back into the shader. Okay, so currently we are working with just one color, right? We're taking this whole texture, we're recoloring it. I'm going to show you a little something I do. I don't know how many other people do this. I kind of just thought about this and eventually came to the conclusion on how to do it. So we're going to create another rounded rectangle, put it directly under. We're going to take all the same information into this one. So plug that same UV node into this. And for the height, what we're actually going to do is we're going to bring up a multiply. Okay. Now if I set this to 1, let's condense it down, plug this into here. This is going to give me the same value, right? We're multiplying by 1. Gives you the same number, right? We plug that into height. We have 2 the exact same thing now. But if I were to lower this to 0.7, we're multiplying that number by 0.7 now. And I have a smaller version of the same thing up here. And what we can do, this is some fancy stuff. We're going to create a subtract node. Okay? Now I always forget which should go first, which should go into A or B, but I think it goes like this. Take the top one, the bigger one, plug it into A, and the bottom one, plug it into B. Right, that's what we want. We're telling this to subtract this bottom part from the top part. So any white values here is getting removed from this texture here. And it'll all make sense why we're doing it this way. So now, instead of coloring the whole texture here, I just want to color this outline because this is going to be my top part now. This is going to be the tippy top of my burst. So I want to plug that in. We want that to be the color of the burst, the top of the burst. And now if I take another multiply and another color, switch it to HDR because we like to be able to bloom when we want. Let's just change the color so it's a little different. I like to do that just so I can see the difference and make sure there's no weirdness going on. So we multiply this bottom part by a color. So now we've got this bottom part colored separately from the top part. We're telling this top part that we don't want the bottom part in it, right? We want it to subtract. We want it to subtract. We want this separate from the bottom. So we're only coloring the top part that is already separated. Now what we can do is create an add node. And we can say, hey, bring these two together. Okay? Add this bottom that's colored and add this top that's colored here. And plug that into our color. Now we have 2 tones of color. And if I create another float here, we can control this multiplier. Let's create a slider, because you know me, I love my sliders. Let's default this to 0.7. Plug it in. Convert it to a property. And we'll call this bottom color height. And let's convert this color into a property. And we'll call this bottom color. Move that above there just for organization. Okay, so now if we hit save and go back into our scene view, we have 2 tones of color going on here, and we love that. So let's go ahead and adjust this bottom color to be something more thematic here, a nice fiery orange. And if you can see, we have some weird sorting going on here, where the back face is kind of sorting above the front face there. You can see that line at the bottom. I don't know why Unity does this, but it just does. So luckily we are using hard edged stuff, so we can tell it to do this. So we're rendering both faces. That's why we're having this issue in the first place. So if we just rendered the front, we wouldn't even see that back face. Or if we were just rendering the back, we would only be seeing the back faces, right? But we really want to see both. So here's what we do. We need to force the depth right. Don't ask me why this works, and see it still doesn't work quite right, and turn on alpha clipping. For some reason, that fixes it, and I have no idea why. But I would love if I didn't have to do all that. So now we have it sorting properly, right? The front's above the front, or front's above the back, no problemo. So we have a really cool looking 2-tone burst here, and we can do whatever colors we want, you know? We want to do blue, we want to do a little, I guess it would be the brighter color on the bottom normally. So if I had brighter blue color and darker top, you know, we do whatever colors we want here. And it looks awesome. And say we wanted to increase the size of that bottom, we have this adjustment we can do here, or we can have more of the bottom color show through, or even less. If we wanted to do just 1-tone color, we could just hide that bottom by doing it like that. but I like it. Sure, about right there looks good. Oh, here's an issue that we need to resolve, okay? This isn't stretching all the way around because, let's see in the shader. See right here? The width. Our width is higher on this one. So let's just copy paste so they have the same value there. Now it's going to fill out all the way around. There we go. Perfect. Since this episode's already getting kind of long and I'm trying to shorten up the length of these so they're more digestible for everybody, I'm going to save the next part for doing stuff in the particle system with this, and I'll show you how to adjust the shader and everything and get some really cool options for using it in the particle system. But for now, let's just see something cool, we can do with this other than this burst, because this burst is what we're going to probably be using in the particle system. So what else could we do mapping this kind of texture to a cylinder? So if I create a new material here, or I just duplicate this one, Control D to duplicate, let's drag the new one on. Now, let's see if we could create sort of fire, right? We love fire. VFX artists are obsessed with fire. So we'll do a darker top color, darker orange, and we'll do a nice yellow there. So we don't want our fire super spiky, so we can increase the tiling on the Y a little bit here. Could probably increase this tiling by a bit so we can get a cool kind of stylized fire look. And let's go ahead and decrease the scale of this on the X and the Z so it kind of gets skinnier but keeps its height. So let's say 0.5 and 0.5 there. Sure, why not? So as you can see, we already have a kind of cool stylized looking fire. But let's see if... So let's go ahead and duplicate this cylinder. Let's make it just a bit smaller on the X and the Z, so it's a little skinnier. And increase the size on the Y a little bit so it stretches up higher. Let's duplicate our material again, Control D. Replace this second one that we just made with a new one. And let's do smoke colors. So for the top, we'll go darker. Sure, about like that. We'll go lighter for the middle. And you know what we can actually do? We can keep these the same size. And on the X and Z. And we can just sort this one above the smoke. That still doesn't work because they're right on top of each other. Let's sort this higher and see if I can... No, since they're right on top of each other, it's not quite working, so we'll just go a little smaller. Let's go 0.45, not 0.75. Sheesh. There, now it's inside. There we go. Now we got a cool looking stylized fire smoke prison, right? We put a little guy in there. Let's put a cube in there. This is a huge cube. Our boy's trapped. And this also can be used with other meshes, obviously, with other UV layouts. So if we make a sphere, right? 3D object, sphere, double click to focus. Let's go ahead and hide these other ones. If we applied the same thing to a sphere, we would get a really cool kind of radial outwards effect because of how the sphere's UVs are laid out. If we increase the height, how cool is that? You could get like a fireball effect out of that if you stretched it. How cool is that? I love doing this. I've definitely used this same shader so many times in my life. I have a lot more controls and stuff. It's more robust in my projects, but this is the basic idea of this two-tone and then mapping it to a mesh, so you get lots of really cool flexibility. And you can use it on multiple kinds of meshes with multiple kinds of layouts and get a lot of cool different effects. So I think that's about it for today. Hope you learned something new. We touched on creating meshes with interesting UV layouts that can have cool effects with shaders. Next episode, we'll take this even further, and I'll show you how to use it in particle systems to tie it all together and show you how you can actively create effects using this stuff. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you did. I'm trying to get these numbers up. Channel hasn't been around very long, so I'm really trying to get a groove here, make sure I'm reaching the right people who need to be learning this stuff. So if you have anybody that's interested in VFX, go ahead and show them this stuff, and I will continue pumping out content and trying to provide more and more knowledge, because knowledge of VFX is kind of hard to come by, so I'm trying to alleviate that a little bit. So hit the subscribe button, tell your mom and dad to watch these videos. They need to know about this stuff too, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much.